The bonfire crackled, spitting embers into the Colorado night like stars breaking free from the sky. Ezra Kane, 26, sat frozen, his heart pounding louder than the pop of burning logs, as he felt the weight of Caleb Holt's gaze. Unwavering, unguarded, and dangerously close. In that fleeting moment, everything Ezra thought he knew about his best friend, the straight-as-an-arrow woodworker who'd never once questioned his own path, began to unravel. Ezra had always been the dreamer of the two, a graphic designer with a sharp wit and a knack for seeing beauty in chaos. At 26, he was openly gay, unapologetic, and fiercely independent, though his heart carried scars from relationships that never quite stuck. Caleb, also 26, was his opposite in every way, a broad-shouldered craftsman who built furniture with his hands and lived by a code of quiet strength. They'd been inseparable since meeting at a Denver Community Art Fair 2 years ago, their friendship forged over late-night talks and shared beers. Caleb's world was all straight lines and certainty, or so Ezra had believed. But tonight, in the backyard of Caleb's modest Arvada home, something shifted. The night had started innocently enough. Ezra had swung by after a long day, needing Caleb's steady presence to ground him. Work had been brutal. A client had trashed his latest design, calling it too bold, and Ezra's confidence was bruised. Caleb, as always, had been there, offering a cold IPA and a listening ear. They'd ended up in the backyard, where Caleb's latest project, a hand-carved cedar bench, sat proudly by the fire pit. "Sit," Caleb had said, his voice low, almost a command. Ezra complied, expecting their usual banter, but the air felt heavier tonight, charged with something neither could name. "You ever think about crossing lines?" Caleb asked suddenly, his blue eyes catching the firelight. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his flannel shirt straining slightly across his shoulders. Ezra blinked, caught off guard. Caleb wasn't one for abstract questions. He built things, tables, chairs, lives, with clear purpose. "What kind of lines?" Ezra replied, his voice teasing but cautious, sensing a current beneath the words. Caleb didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his beer, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "Lines you don't cross, like things you're supposed to be, or not be." His words hung there, raw and unpolished, like the rough edge of a plank he hadn't yet sanded smooth. Ezra's stomach twisted. Was this about him? About them? He'd spent months burying his attraction to Caleb, convincing himself it was one-sided, impossible. Caleb was straight. He'd dated women, talked about them casually, never hinted at anything else. But now, the way Caleb's gaze lingered, the way his knee brushed Ezra's as he shifted closer, it felt like a line was already blurring. "I cross lines all the time," Ezra said, forcing a laugh to mask the tremor in his voice. "You're the one who likes everything neat and tidy." Caleb's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Maybe I'm tired of tidy," he murmured, and Ezra's breath caught. The fire snapped, sending a spark skyward, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. Caleb set his beer down, his movements deliberate. "Ezra," he said, his voice rougher now, "what if I told you I've been thinking about you? Not just as you know, my buddy." The confession landed like a hammer on glass, shattering the fragile balance of their friendship. Ezra's mind raced. Was this real? Was Caleb, the guy who'd spent his life building safe, predictable things, actually saying this? Before Ezra could respond, Caleb leaned in, his hand grazing Ezra's wrist. A touch so light it could have been accidental, but it wasn't. The warmth of his fingers sent a jolt through Ezra, and suddenly, the line wasn't just blurred. it was gone. The rest of the night unfolded like a dream Ezra was afraid to wake from. They talked, really talked. For hours, Caleb's words spilling out in a way Ezra had never heard before. He spoke of his small-town upbringing in Wyoming, where being different wasn't an option, where expectations had boxed him in. He admitted he'd never questioned his identity until Ezra came along, with his fearless authenticity and quiet strength. "You make me want to be more," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. By the time the fire died to embers, Caleb's hand was still on Ezra's, and the space between them had vanished entirely. As dawn crept over the Rockies, Ezra felt the weight of what had happened. They hadn't kissed, hadn't crossed that final boundary, but the air between them was electric with possibility. Caleb's confession had opened a door, and Ezra wasn't sure either of them could close it now. But with that possibility came fear. What did this mean for Caleb, who'd never navigated these waters? What did it mean for their friendship, for the life Ezra had carefully built around being true to himself without losing the people he loved? The morning light cast long shadows across the backyard, and Ezra glanced at Caleb, who was staring at the horizon, his jaw tight. "You okay?" Ezra asked, his voice soft. Caleb nodded, but his eyes were stormy. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to lose this. Lose you." Ezra's heart ached at the vulnerability in his words. This was no longer just about one night. It was about everything that came after. The days after that night felt like walking a tightrope. Ezra couldn't shake the memory of Caleb's hand on his, the way his voice had cracked when he spoke of wanting more. But Caleb, true to his nature, retreated into silence, throwing himself into his workshop with a focus that bordered on obsession. Ezra tried to give him space, but every unanswered text, every avoided glance when they crossed paths at the local coffee shop, cut deeper than he cared to admit. Ezra's apartment in Denver's Capitol Hill felt emptier than usual. He sat at his drafting table, sketching aimlessly, the lines of his designs as unsteady as his thoughts. He'd always prided himself on his resilience, on navigating the world as a gay black man with his head held high. But Caleb's confession had stirred something deeper, a longing he'd buried beneath layers of self-protection. He wanted to believe Caleb's words, but doubt gnawed at him. Was Caleb just confused, caught up in a moment? Or was this real, something worth risking their friendship for? Caleb, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own storm. In his workshop, surrounded by the scent of sawdust and varnish, he sanded a maple table with relentless precision. Each stroke was an attempt to quiet the chaos in his mind. He'd grown up in a world of clear rules. Men loved women, built families, followed the script. He'd never questioned it, not through high school crushes or fleeting relationships. But Ezra had changed everything. His laughter, his unapologetic honesty, the way he challenged Caleb to see the world differently. It had crept under his skin, rewriting the rules he'd lived by. One evening, unable to stand the silence any longer, Ezra drove to Caleb's workshop unannounced. The door was ajar, and he found Caleb hunched over a workbench, his hands steady but his eyes distant. "We need to talk," Ezra said, his voice firm but not unkind. Caleb flinched, setting down his chisel. "I know," he said, but he didn't meet Ezra's gaze. The air was thick with tension, the kind that could either break them or bind them closer. Ezra stepped forward, closing the distance. "You can't just say what you said and then disappear, Caleb. That's not fair. Not to me, not to you." Caleb's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Ezra saw the weight he was carrying. "I don't know how to do this," Caleb said, his voice raw. "I've never felt like this. Not about anyone." and it scares the hell out of me." Ezra's heart twisted, but he kept his voice steady. "You think I'm not scared? You think I don't know what it's like to want something you're not sure you're allowed to have?" Caleb finally looked up, his eyes searching Ezra's. "What if I mess this up? What if I'm not what you need?" The vulnerability in his words hit Ezra like a wave. He wanted to reach out to pull Caleb close, but he held back. This wasn't just about them. It was about Caleb confronting a part of himself he'd never acknowledged. "You don't have to have all the answers," Ezra said softly. "But you have to be honest. With me. With yourself." That night, they didn't solve everything. But they talked, late into the evening, surrounded by half-finished furniture and the hum of a space heater. Caleb admitted he'd been avoiding Ezra not out of regret, but out of fear of what his feelings meant, fear of judgment from the world he'd known. Ezra shared his own fears, the times he'd been burned by love, the weight of being seen as too much by others. For the first time, they were fully open, no walls between them. By the time Ezra left, the air felt lighter, but the path ahead was still uncertain. Caleb walked him to his car, his hand brushing Ezra's as they stood under the streetlight. "I'm not running," Caleb said, his voice steady now. "I just need time." Ezra nodded, his chest tight with hope and hesitation. "Take it. But I'm not going anywhere." Weeks passed, and the fragile balance between Ezra and Caleb held. They fell into a new rhythm. Coffee meetups, late-night texts, cautious moments of closeness that never quite crossed into more. Ezra tried to be patient, but the waiting was torture. Every brush of Caleb's hand, every lingering glance, was a reminder of what could be and what might never be. Caleb, for his part, was trying. He'd started reading about queer identities online, quietly grappling with questions he'd never dared ask before. But the weight of his upbringing lingered, a shadow he couldn't shake. One Saturday, Caleb invited Ezra to a local craft fair in Boulder, where he was showcasing his furniture. The fair was alive with color and sound. Artisans hawking pottery, musicians strumming guitars, families weaving through stalls. Caleb's booth was simple but striking, his handcrafted tables and chairs drawing admiring glances. Ezra arrived late, his heart lifting at the sight of Caleb in his element, explaining his work to a customer with quiet pride. As the day wound down, they wandered the fair together, sharing a pretzel and laughing over a vendor's absurdly priced candles. For a moment, it felt like old times, before the night that changed everything. But then Caleb stopped at a stall selling hand-painted signs, his eyes catching on one that read, "Be brave." He bought it without a word, tucking it under his arm. Ezra raised an eyebrow but didn't push. He knew Caleb well enough to sense when something was brewing. That evening, they ended up at a quiet bar on Pearl Street, the kind with dim lighting and worn wooden tables. Over whiskey, Caleb opened up. "I told my sister about you," he said, his voice low. Ezra's heart skipped. Caleb's sister, Lila, was his closest family, a no-nonsense nurse who lived in Cheyenne. "And," Ezra prompted, bracing himself. Caleb's lips quirked. "She said I'm an idiot for taking so long to figure myself out, and that I better not screw this up." Ezra laughed, relief flooding him. But Caleb wasn't done. "I've been talking to my dad, too," he said, his tone heavier. "He's old school, doesn't get it. Keeps asking when I'm gonna settle down with a nice girl." Ezra's stomach tightened. He knew how much Caleb's father meant to him, how deeply those expectations ran. "What did you say?" Ezra asked. Caleb met his gaze, unflinching. "I told him I'm figuring out what I want, not what he wants." The words hit Ezra hard. He'd spent years fighting for his own truth, but seeing Caleb, someone who'd never had to question his place in the world. Take those first steps was something else entirely. Without thinking, Ezra reached across the table, his hand covering Caleb's. "You're braver than you think," he said. Caleb didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand, lacing their fingers together, and for the first time, Ezra felt the weight of possibility outweigh the fear. That night, as they walked back to Caleb's truck, the air was crisp with autumn. Caleb stopped suddenly, pulling Ezra into a shadowed alcove by the street. "I'm done overthinking this," he said, his voice rough with resolve. Before Ezra could respond, Caleb kissed him. A kiss that was tentative at first, then fierce, full of everything they'd both been holding back. It was messy, imperfect, and real, and Ezra felt his heart crack open in the best way. The kiss changed everything, and nothing. Ezra and Caleb were no longer just friends, but they weren't quite something else either. They navigated their new reality with cautious steps, stealing moments when they could. A quiet dinner at Ezra's apartment, a hike in the foothills where their hands brushed but didn't quite hold. It was exhilarating, but it was also fragile. Ezra felt the weight of Caleb's hesitation, the way he'd tense when they were in public, glancing around as if expecting judgment. Caleb was struggling, too. The kiss had been a revelation, but it also forced him to confront the parts of himself he'd buried. He loved Ezra. There was no denying it now, but the world he'd known wasn't ready for this version of him. His father's disapproval weighed heavily, and whispers from old friends in Wyoming had started to reach him. "You're different," one had said over a tense phone call. "What's going on with you?" Caleb didn't have an answer, not one they'd understand. The breaking point came at a community barbecue in Arvada, hosted by a mutual friend, Marissa. The backyard was packed with locals, artists, small business owners, families. Ezra and Caleb arrived together, their dynamics subtle but undeniable to anyone paying attention. Marissa, who'd known them both for years, pulled Ezra aside with a grin. "You two are cute," she teased. Ezra smiled, but his eyes were on Caleb, who was stiffening under the gaze of a group of older craftsmen he'd worked with. One of them, a grizzled man named Hank, clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "Heard you're spending a lot of time with that artist kid," he said, his tone light but pointed. "Hope he's not pulling you into his world." The words were a gut punch, and Caleb's face tightened. Ezra, standing nearby, heard it all. He waited for Caleb to push back, to say something, anything, but Caleb just muttered, "It's not like that," and turned away. The ride home was silent. Ezra stared out the window, his chest tight with hurt. "You didn't have to lie," he said finally, his voice low. Caleb gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I didn't lie," he said, but it sounded weak, even to him. Ezra turned to him, his eyes blazing. "You let him think I'm just some phase, like I'm not worth standing up for." Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw tight. "I'm trying, Ezra," he said. "This isn't easy for me." "It's not easy for me either," Ezra shot back. "I've spent my life fighting to be seen, to be enough. I'm not doing that with you, too." The words hung heavy, and when Caleb pulled up to Ezra's apartment, neither moved. Finally, Ezra got out, slamming the door harder than he meant to. Caleb didn't follow. For days, they didn't speak. Ezra threw himself into work, his designs sharper, angrier, each stroke a release of the hurt he carried. Caleb stayed in his workshop, but his hands felt unsteady, his focus gone. He missed Ezra, not just the possibility of them, but the friendship that had grounded him for years. He knew he'd hurt Ezra, and the shame of it gnawed at him. But he also knew he couldn't keep hiding. Ezra was sketching in his apartment when the knock came. It was late, the kind of hour where only bad news or bold choices showed up. He opened the door to find Caleb standing there, holding the Be Brave sign from the craft fair. His eyes were red-rimmed, his flannel rumpled, but his gaze was steady. "Can we talk?" he asked. They sat on Ezra's couch, the sign resting between them like a silent challenge. Caleb spoke first, his voice low but resolute. "I messed up," he said. "At the barbecue I froze. I let you down, and I hate myself for it." Ezra stayed quiet, letting him continue. "I've been scared," Caleb admitted. "Not just of what people think, but of who I am. I've spent my whole life building things to last. Tables, chairs, a life I thought I was supposed to want. But none of it means anything without you." Ezra's throat tightened. He wanted to stay angry, to protect himself, but Caleb's words were raw, unguarded. "What do you want, Caleb?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb reached for his hand, his touch steady this time. "You," he said simply. "I want you, and I'm done hiding it." The weeks that followed were a slow, beautiful rebuilding. Caleb started small, holding Ezra's hand in public, introducing him as his partner to Marissa, then Lila. His father was harder, the conversations tense, but Caleb didn't back down. He was learning to live authentically, not just for Ezra but for himself. Ezra, too, found himself softening, letting go of the fear that Caleb would pull away again. One evening, they returned to Caleb's backyard, where it all began. The cedar bench was still there, now weathered by time. Caleb had carved their initials into it, a quiet promise etched in wood. They sat together, the fire pit glowing, and Ezra felt a peace he hadn't known in years. "You crossed the line," he said, teasing but warm. Caleb grinned, pulling him close. "Best decision I ever made." Their story wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, whispers from some, silence from others. But together, they built something stronger than doubt, something as enduring as Caleb's furniture. One unexpected night had changed everything, and in its wake, they found not just love, but the courage to live it fully.